The sand is moving, not slowly, not gently. It is moving the way a tide moves, with purpose, with hunger, with the indifference of something that has existed for 10,000 years and intends to exist for 10,000 more. Stand at the southern edge of the Sahara in the early morning light, when the air is still cool and the sky is that particular shade of violet that exists nowhere else on Earth, and you will feel it before you see it, a fine grit against your teeth, a whisper at the back of your throat. The desert is breathing, and it is breathing outward, consuming everything in its path. Farmland, villages, roads, memory. This process has a name: desertification, and for decades it has been eating sub-Saharan Africa at a rate of roughly 48 kilometers per year. Entire communities swallowed, entire ways of life erased, children growing up in landscapes their grandparents would not recognize. So the world decided to fight back. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. Plant trees, millions of them, hundreds of millions, stretch a wall of green across the entire width of the African continent, from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. 8,000 kilometers, a living barrier between the encroaching desert and the people it threatened to consume. They called it the Great Green Wall, and when it was announced in 2007, it felt like something unprecedented. Humanity, at last, choosing to act on the scale the problem demanded. But something went wrong, or rather, something went wrong in the way that things always go wrong when human beings, armed with good intentions and incomplete knowledge, attempt to impose order on a system that has been finding its own order for millennia. The trees began to die, millions of them, planted in long regimented rows, monocultures, a single species, Acacia Senegal, chosen for its fast growth and its ability to fix nitrogen in the soil. They were planted the way a government plants things, efficiently, uniformly, at scale. And for a while, in photographs taken from above, it looked like progress. Green lines appearing in the ochre expanse, hope made visible from space. But the Sahel is not a photograph. It is a living system of extraordinary complexity, a place where rainfall is not predictable but cyclical, where soils shift between types within a single kilometer, where the relationship between plant and soil and animal and atmosphere has been negotiating itself across geological time. And the trees, these millions of trees, planted in rows without regard for species diversity, without regard for local hydrology, without regard for what had lived in these places before, they were not part of that negotiation. They were an imposition. The roots could not hold soil that had already lost its structure. The monocultures attracted specific insects in catastrophic numbers, insects that swept through hectare after hectare of identical trees, the way fire moves through dry grass. Without the understory plants, without the shrubs and grasses that normally break the force of rainfall and hold moisture in the upper layers of the soil, the rain, when it came, ran straight off the baked earth and carried the topsoil with it. And then there was something no one had quite anticipated, something ecological, something almost cruel in its irony. The trees, it turned out, were thirsty. In a landscape where water is not merely scarce but sacred, where a single underground aquifer might be the only reason a village exists, the planted trees were drawing water from the water table at rates that the landscape could not sustain. In some regions, wells that had supplied communities for generations began to run dry within years of large-scale planting. The trees were not saving the land. In places, they were drinking it. This is the moment in the story where it would be easy to reach for cynicism, to say, human beings always make things worse. That intervention is inevitably hubris, that we should have left the desert to its expanding silence. But that would be too simple. And the truth, the actual, difficult, quietly extraordinary truth, is more interesting than cynicism. Because at roughly the same time that the top-down, government-mandated tree planting programs were struggling and failing, something else was happening. Something almost invisible, happening on the ground, farm by farm, village by village, across the Sahel. Farmers were growing their own trees, without being told, without funding, without satellite imagery or international conferences. They were doing it the way their great-grandparents had done it, by watching the land, reading its moods, understanding its particular hungers and rhythms. The technique has a name now, in development literature: Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, or FMNR. But the farmers who practice it have a simpler understanding. They are not planting trees, they are releasing them. Consider what this means. Beneath the surface of what appears to be bare, degraded, lifeless soil, the root systems of trees that were cut down decades or centuries ago during colonial-era land clearing, during the great agricultural expansions of the 20th century, many of these root systems are still alive, dormant, waiting. The scientific term is a lignotuber, a woody, swollen base from which new growth can emerge given the right conditions. In the Sahel, the soil is full of them, tens of millions of them, a subterranean forest, invisible, patient, older than any living human being. What the farmers discovered, or rather what they remembered because this knowledge existed in their communities before it was discarded in favor of modern agricultural practice, was that if you protect these root systems, if you stop cutting the shoots that emerge from them, if you selectively prune to guide growth rather than eliminate it, the trees come back, not in decades, in years, sometimes in months. In Niger alone, farmers using this approach have regenerated somewhere between 200 and 250 million trees since the 1980s, without international funding, without government mandates, without a single press conference. This is, by some measures, the largest environmental restoration in human history, and most people have never heard of it. Sit with that for a moment. 250 million trees, growing not because they were planted, but because people stopped removing them. There is a philosophy embedded in this that reaches far beyond agriculture. We tend to think of restoration as something active, as something we do to the land. We clear, we plant, we irrigate, we manage. We are the agents of recovery, and nature is the patient. But what the Sahel is teaching, what it has always known, is that nature is not a patient. It is not waiting to be healed by us. It is waiting simply for us to get out of the way, or rather, to become partners rather than managers, to stop imposing and start listening. The acacia trees that failed were not wrong trees exactly. Acacia senegal is a genuine native of the Sahel, but a single species planted in rows in alien soil, without the biological community it evolved alongside, and a tree without its ecosystem is not a tree in any meaningful ecological sense. It is a green object in a dead landscape. A forest is not a collection of trees any more than a symphony is a collection of notes. In the places where regeneration has worked, in the Zinda and Maradi regions of Niger, in parts of Burkina Faso and Mali, the change is not merely visual, though the visual change is dramatic. Photographs taken in the 1980s and compared to images of the same locations today show something that seems, at first glance, like a compositing error. Bare red earth replaced by dense, complex, multi-layered vegetation. But the deeper change is ecological. Soil organic matter is increasing. Water infiltration rates, the speed at which rainfall enters the soil rather than running off, have risen dramatically. Crop yields on farms within regenerated areas are higher because the trees provide nitrogen fixation, wind protection, and shade that moderates soil temperature. Birds have returned, insects have returned, the food web is reweaving itself. And here is something that took researchers a while to understand. The rainfall patterns in regenerated areas appear to be changing. Not dramatically, not yet, but local vegetation cover affects what is called the albedo of a landscape, the degree to which it reflects or absorbs solar radiation. Bare desert reflects enormous amounts of energy back into the atmosphere, driving convective patterns that suppress cloud formation. Green vegetation absorbs more energy, releases moisture through transpiration, and can, in aggregate, at scale, begin to alter the atmospheric conditions that determine whether rain falls. This is the most extraordinary possibility of all, that the land, if given the chance to restore itself, might begin to call the rain back. It sounds like myth. It sounds like the kind of thing people say around fires in the dark when science has gone quiet and older, knowing fills the silence. But the modeling exists. The data is emerging. The relationship between African vegetation cover and the West African monsoon is real and measurable, and there are researchers now who believe that sufficient restoration across the Sahel could meaningfully shift precipitation patterns across the region. The desert made the desert. Deforestation drove desertification, which suppressed rainfall, which prevented regrowth, which drove more desertification. A feedback loop running backwards, feeding on itself. But feedback loops can run in both directions. Green calls green, water calls water, life calls life. This is what ecology actually is beneath the textbooks and the data tables. It is not the study of separate things. It is the study of relationships. Intricate, ancient, reciprocal relationships between organisms and atmosphere and soil and water that have been negotiating themselves since before anything we would recognize as landscape existed on this planet. To disrupt one relationship is to send tremors through the entire system. To restore one relationship is potentially to begin restoring all of them, which brings us back to the trees, the millions of trees that died, the disaster that was also, in its own terrible way, a teacher. The Great Green Wall Initiative has evolved significantly since its early monoculture phase. The original vision, a literal wall of trees stretching coast to coast, has been replaced by something more subtle and more honest, a mosaic of approaches. Farmer Managed Regeneration at the core. Strategic planting of diverse native species where planting is appropriate. Restoration of traditional water harvesting systems. The ancient half-moon earthworks called demilunes that catch rainfall and direct it to where plants can use it. Integration of livestock management so that grazing pressure allows rather than prevents recovery. It is slower, it is less photogenic, it does not generate the same headlines as the announcement of 100 million trees planted in a single season, but it is working. 11 million hectares. That is the area of restored land reported across the Great Green Wall corridor as of the early 2020s. To contextualize that, it is roughly the area of Bulgaria or the state of Virginia or the island of Cuba restored in a generation, not by planting primarily, but by changing the relationship between people and the living world they depend on. The villages near acacia-rich restored farmland in Niger report something that does not appear in ecological data sets. They report a sense, described differently by different people, but pointing toward the same feeling, a sense that the land is coming home. That something that was lost, something that existed in the memories of grandparents and in old names for places that no longer resembled their names, is becoming recognizable again. There is a Hausa word, farin chiki, which means something like joy of the belly, a deep-bodied happiness that comes not from acquisition but from belonging, from being in right relationship with a place. The trees are not just carbon, they are not just erosion control or water regulation or crop yield improvement. They are the architecture of belonging. They are the structures within which human lives have meaning in this particular part of the world. This is what was lost when they were cut. This is what is returning when they are allowed to return. There are children growing up in the Maradi region of Niger today who are walking through landscapes that did not exist when they were born. Dappled shade in places that were bare red earth when their parents were young, the sound of birds that their grandparents named but they had never heard. They are inheriting something that was very nearly gone forever, not because of a decision made in an international conference room, though those decisions mattered too, but because farmers, in the early morning light, watched the land and noticed the shoots coming up and decided this time to let them grow. What does it mean to plant a tree you will never sit under? Every culture that has lived close to the land has some version of this question. It is perhaps the most ancient form of hope, to act in service of a future you will not inhabit, for the benefit of people you will never meet, in partnership with a world that operates on timescales that dwarf a human life. The Sahel is not saved. Let no one say that. The pressures are real and ongoing, and the climate is continuing to change in ways that make the work harder with every passing year. There are places where the sand is still moving, still breathing outward, still erasing the evidence of what was once there. But there are also places, millions of hectares of places, where something is breathing back, where the soil remembers what it was, where roots that waited in darkness for decades are finally reaching toward light, where the land and the people living on it are in the slow, difficult, necessary process of learning to listen to each other again. That is not a small thing. That is in fact the only thing, the only way forward that has ever actually worked. Not the imposition of solutions onto living systems, but the patient, humble, extraordinary work of restoring relationship between tree and soil, between rain and root, between human hands and the ancient, breathing, endlessly forgiving world that made us. The sand is still moving, but in the morning light, so are the leaves.